Hey guys, cool. Let's continue with our mission. Once you start those things, it feels like you can't stop. So let's get into it. So now what I'll be presenting is develop Azure functions, explore Azure functions development, right? So there are two important pieces of a function that we need to take note of, which is one, the code itself, two, some configs in functions.json file, which is a configuration file. For compiled languages, the config file can be generated automatically from the annotations in your code. So you can use code annotations to actually, create your configurations and all of that, which makes the need for this to be close to zero. Functions.json defines functions triggers, bindings, and other configuration settings. A function can only have one trigger. Right? This we need to take note. The function can only have one trigger. Then, so return data for example. Okay, here's an example of our function, the JSON file. Here it shows us if the function is enabled or disabled. Then here it has a list of bindings. So here, if you look at that on type, what we have is a binding type. So probably would have a trigger type there. And the direction is in. Then the name of the parameter that we'll be using for that binding. That's my param name in that case. The bindings property is where you configure both triggers and bindings. Each binding shares a few common settings and some settings which are specific to a particular type of binding. Every binding requires the following settings, right? You need to set up the type, you need to set up the direction, and you need to set up the name. All of this are of type string, right? Then direction indicates whether the bindings of for receiving data into the function or sending data from the functions. For example, in and out, and the name. Type, for example, Q trigger. Let's say, for example, that's what I was talking about. That you'd have a binding type, or a Q trigger. That's one of the types that's accepted there. Function apps provide an execution context in Azure for which functions in the function app run. Functions app in is the unit of deployment. The function app is the unit of deployment, and also function app provides an execution context in Azure for functions. And so let's read that again. Function app is the unit of deployment and management for features and comprises of one or more individual functions that are managed, deployed, and scaled together. So in a function app, as I mentioned, you can get a couple of functions in there. NB function apps version 2.x, so 2 version 2 going up requires all functions to be written in the same language. Previous versions did not require this. So in a function app, all functions, all functions in a function app, all functions must be written in the same language, right? On previous versions, this was not the case. Or if you go 1 point something, version 1 point something, you could use multiple languages. Code for all functions in a function app is located in the root project folder, and that contains the config file. So the host.json file must be exactly where the function app is actually located. Bin folder contains packages, uh, and other libraries that function app requires. Specific folder structure required is specified by the programming language. So programming language would, let's say, for example, you have an exe or a DLL or whatever, then a bunch of other structured folders. So that will be determined by the language you use. So from C# to Java to Python, it will all be different. Full local development environment. Functions are easy to develop locally on your favorite code editor and deployment tools to implement and test. Can also connect to live Azure service with full debug capabilities. Do not mix local development with portal development in the same function app. Do not modify code. So what that means is do not modify code in portal if you use local project, create and publish. So what is the problem here? Say for example you're using a scripting language like JavaScript or Python. You go to the Azure portal, you realize that your function has a bug. What you then do is you edit that code file on Azure and you publish that. Then after that, you test it and it works. When doing this, you actually forgot that on your local, in your source control, or whatever the case might be, that code is not updated. Then when you do a deployment, because you're mixing these two paradigms, now you don't have a consistent function, essentially. Then create triggers and bindings. Triggers define how a function is invoked. As we mentioned previously, triggers are associated with data that is often the function's payload. Bindings are of declarative. Bindings are a declarative. I don't know what that is. Bindings are declarative. Okay, let's put it in that way. Bindings are declarative and provide connecting ability to another resource to the function. So bindings are declarative and they enable us to connect into the function from another Azure resource, such as, let's say, service bus or whatever, right? They give us an input or output type of functionality. So using a binding, we can write to some service or we can get data from another service. Data from binding is provided to the function as a parameter. A function can have multiple input or output bindings, so there's no limitations there. But remember that it can only have one trigger. Triggers and bindings avoids hard coding access to other services. So these bindings essentially they give us an ability to connect to, let's say, for example, a storage account or whatever. We don't need to write the code to actually go with, let's say, for example, the blob one that we're talking about, where we have to create the blob, upload a blob, whatever. We can take what you call, let's say, a file stream or whatever, return it, and the blob knows how to handle that, or the bindings that you have there knows what to do. C# and Java do not rely on function.json, hence cannot edit triggers and bindings on the portal. For other languages, you can use Code plus Test Lab to edit the bindings. Because these are compiled languages, chances are that's why you can't do that. Binding directions. Triggers are always in or use the in direction, while bindings can be in and out. Remember what we said, triggers are inputs, or triggers invoke our functions and they are technically payloads into our functions. Bindings give us more data, or we can use bindings to read more data, or use binding to write out outputs to our functions, essentially. Uh, Bindings and implementation example. There's a code there. Not sure if I should go through it or not. Let's do it after the video. Connect functions to Azure services. Azure functions use application settings when running in the Azure function service, or from local settings files when developing locally. Cannot specify app secrets in the function.json file because there's a key vault for that. Can use identity passed connection. Some services could still require a connection string while supporting identity passed connections, right? So let's say, for example, you're developing locally, and as a user on a Visual Studio, you've logged into your what do you call AAD account, and once you have that logged in, you can technically access resources using, let's say, a role-based access control type of access. So they are saying some functions support that, or some services support that, and you can use that in a function, but others do not actually support that. Hence why you need to put in the connection string. Here there's a note that says durable functions do not support identity connections. This is interesting. We need to take note of that, though we're going to talk about durable functions at some point. Managed identity is used when running functions in the Azure functions. So in Azure functions, what do we use? Managed identity. When we are running it locally, what do we use? Develop identity. Develop identity. Any identity used must be granted permissions to perform intended action. This can be done using role-based access control or access policy, depending on the service to which you want to connect to. Folio. Next, we're gonna implement the function. So that's that. I think I've missed one detail somewhere on the previous presentation, but I will just add it to this video I remember, I'll just create another one. So create triggers and bindings. This is what the definition looks like. So there's actually code to do that. Person that JavaScript version of it. Class library examples. There's that. Okay, so this is creating a function actually. That's what that looks like. Okay. So this is trigger bindings using vehicle function.json or configuration file. There's that. The direction that we're talking about, that triggers, essentially they explain that they are class libraries, they decorate our methods. I wish there was one. Let me just show you. Okay, cool. Look at what they have here. They have a Q trigger there. So they didn't have to specify it. For C#, you don't have to specify it. There is the Q trigger. You need to give it the relevant information. It knows how to, read from the queue as and when the payload comes as required. Then you could have another output binding. Here they don't have an output binding, but you could have one that connects out whatever the output of the function is, or this return type essentially. Yeah, okay, look, here they have a return that essentially returns to a table storage, and it has a connection to the table storage. So whatever that gets returns out of this function gets stored in what do you call it, in the table storage, and the table name is output table. And here would be the configuration, the connection string to that table storage service essentially. Julio, hope that makes sense. Thank you very much.